Hello everyone. So for this discussion assignment, we're looking at the four major types of data that we use to study personality in people. What I call SIBL or SIBL, self-report, informant or interview, behavioral, and L for life or life outcome. I just want to briefly review them to help set you up for this week's discussion assignment. Starting with S. S is most important to this course, self-report. And the reason why is because the bulk of the material in your textbook, the bulk of the research we'll be talking about, and the bulk of what we know about personality comes from this one data type, the self-report data type. And really it comes down to simply, if we want to ask or learn something about someone, why not ask them? No one knows you better than you. No one knows the inner complexity, the rich diversity of thoughts and feelings and experiences that you've had. No one knows that better than you. You are the expert on you. So it makes sense to ask you about your personality, about the way you think, about the way you feel, and what you do or what you like to do, about your preferences. All that comes to us from self-report data. There are obvious advantages to this. It's super easy to do. People take little surveys in magazines or online all the time. That's a self-report survey. A different kind of example of a self-report might be if you're thinking about buying something on Amazon.com and you're not sure about it, so you might read purchasers' reviews of that product. So they're talking about in their little review whether they like the product or not. What you may not get, though, is that that's actually a self-report kind of information. They're asking about their own experiences with that product, whether they like that product or not, whether they give high ratings or low ratings to that product or not. They're all really talking about themselves in relation to that product. And that leads us to a downside of self-report measures. That kind of data can have some bias. When someone says a product is terrible, what they're really telling you in that Amazon review is their own experience with that product is terrible. Well, they may not be a clever person when it comes to using that particular kind of product, and that's why they didn't have a good experience. People don't like to say bad things about themselves, and that affects the way they do self-report measures. So that's a big downside, is that sometimes people won't tell you the truth about themselves. We're going to see in a number of personality tests, especially in the trait theory of psychology, what kind of personality type you have depends on what you think you have. It also depends on what you want to have. People who like to think of themselves as punctual will report themselves as being punctual people. Even if everyone who knows them will tell you, no, they're late to everything. But if in their own minds they think they're on time, well, the self-report, they're not lying, they're not trying to be deceitful in the self-report data, but they're not accurate. So that's a downside to the self-report approach. But again, you have to balance that against Funder's first law, that there's everything that has a strength also has an equal weakness. The strength of the self-report measure, you are the expert of yourself. The weakness is you're not an unbiased expert on yourself. Some theories in psychology are going to appeal more to the self-report approach than others. In SIBL, there's I, that's informant or interview, that's the next one. So I'll give you another example there. Let's say you're on social media, you're on Facebook or whatever, and you post something, and people who know you give a like. They indicate a liking or a heart or whatever to something you've posted. Other people who know you are rating you, so to speak. They're rating whatever content you just put up in social media. That's informants. These are people who know you and who are asked to give information about you, like in an interview. The advantage there is they see you in different situations in the real world. They see what you actually do and how you actually behave, and that can be insightful. They also don't suffer from your biases about yourself, so they can provide some objective information about you. That's a huge plus. That's a huge win. The downside is they may have biases about you as well. If they know you, they're either a coworker or a family member or a friend, and all of those kinds of relationships bring biases with them. That's a downside. That's a problem. Another big problem with the informant or interview approach is that the way you act around your friends, there may be certain words you may use around your friends you'd never use in front of your grandmother. If we interview your friends and we interview your grandmother, we may get very different pictures of who you are as a person, or at least when it comes to what kind of language you use, how you portray yourself or present yourself to others. That's a big downside with the informant or interview perspective. We're asking people who've seen you in particular situations. Few people, however, have seen you in all or nearly all situations. That's a downside. B comes next for behavioral. Many people who work for me in my office have a Fitbit. Even if they don't really exercise, they all seem to have these, but I won't talk about that. The idea of a Fitbit is that it's measuring what you're doing. For example, how many steps you take today. The behavioral approach doesn't ask why you do things, it only asks what you do. What do you actually do? What actual behaviors do you engage in, typically in particular environments or situations? So the behavioral approach tries to get outside of self-report or interview report. It looks at what you do. As you might guess, the cognitive learning behavioral theory in psychology and personality theory really likes the behavioral approach to personality data. The downside there, obviously the strength is that it's much more objective. The Fitbit isn't biased. It's going to measure how many steps you take, whether you like it or not, whether you exercise or not. Maybe you're not going to look at that Fitbit report, but it is pretty objective. That's a huge advantage over the other measures, the other types of data. The downside is typically, though, our behaviors, like the situation when we're with our friends or with our grandmothers, our behaviors are often situation bound. And if we want to understand something about someone's personality, let's say I want to learn something about you when it comes to emergency situations. How do you act in an emergency or in a crisis? How do you feel? What do you think? What do you say? What do you do? Well, I can ask you that stuff, but the best way is to measure your behaviors in an emergency. Problem, I need to see you in the emergency. It's the crisis situation. By definition, crises happen because we typically don't plan for them or they occur unpredictably. How do you know when to measure someone if you don't know when to measure someone? You can't control the crisis. As Funder tells us in the textbook, the best we can do is create a simulation of a crisis in a laboratory situation. And as you recall from one of Funder's laws, that something is better than nothing, that's what we often do. We'll create a situation, an experimental crisis or laboratory situation, and measure people's behaviors in that situation. Obviously, the downside is people know they're in an experiment. They know they're being watched. They probably have a good idea this isn't a true experimental, true crisis. So that's going to affect how authentically they're going to behave. So that's a big downside, that behavior is often situation specific, and there are many situations that we can't measure directly or we'd have difficulty measuring directly. The last kind is L, or life outcome. That's pretty kind of cut and dried, kind of recorded kind of data. So an example would be your GPA. That's an L form of data. It's related to your behaviors, but it's typically more objective in the sense that it's documented. Typically we can find it in records or archives. So your high school GPA, we can look at other kinds of outcomes that are important, whether you were promoted for a job or not, whether you were demoted, whether you're promoted for rank in the military. That's a life outcome data. Those are really important. They affect people's lives. They connect to the real world. It's not biased in the sense that you're not talking about yourself and we're not asking your friends to talk about you. It either happened or it didn't. Either you got the promotion or you didn't. Either you have a certain GPA or you don't. And they are about you, uniquely you. The downside with life outcome data, even though it's so very important and it has real world value, the downside is whether you get a promotion or not depends on 1,000 different things. Your GPA may reflect how hard a worker you are in terms of your personality, but it may reflect that you took classes that term that were particularly challenging. So lots of different things can influence life outcome data. That's the downside. The great strength, back to that Funder's Law, the great strength and the great weakness are coupled together. The strength is that it's based in the real world, it's the actual life that you're experiencing. The weakness, the downside, is that it's always affected by many, many, many variables, not just your personality. So we have to take that into account. So all four of these methods for data collection for personality have strengths and they have the weaknesses. And you're going to see these different theories tend to lean toward one data type versus the other. What are we going to do? They all have weaknesses. We want to get away from the weaknesses. We want as scientifically precise as possible a measure of someone's personality. What do? A great solution for all four data types is the principle of aggregation, which is simply the more measurements you take, doesn't matter what kind of data we're looking at, the more measurements you take, the more accurate the overall measurement will be. That's the principle of aggregation. So if we're going to look at your GPA, we also need to look at your test scores, SAT or ACT. We need to look at other indications of your academic performance, not just one. If we're going to measure your self-esteem, we're not going to ask you one question about yourself. We're going to ask you 10 or 20 or 150 different questions. The more different questions we ask about you, the more accurate and the less variability, the less error we're going to have. So the principle of aggregation is a big savior for us when we look at the different types of data. So I hope that's given you a kind of a good base understanding of the four different types of data collection for personality. I hope you'll take that into consideration. Be sure to read carefully the chapter as well on the four different types of data before you respond to the questions for the assignment for this discussion. And I look forward to reading your responses. Until next time.